Russia is consistently failing in its strategy. Vladimir Putin has no idea what he's doing. They say the war has been going on for 4 years, and yet they're still winning it. Only now, on one hand, the most fervent supporters of the Russian Federation are sending messages. Well, even people who wholeheartedly support the Russian Federation, but who are already absolutely desperate to see this war of attrition. The truth is that it's not moving forward or backward, or at least that's how it seems. On the other hand, there are the so-called supporters, really. Those who just come to stir up trouble. And well, it's worth noting that, in fact, not that much has really been achieved. So, in the background, the real issue is the energy attacks that the Russian Federation is carrying out right now, which it has started to conduct in such a historic and massive way only in the 4th year of the special military operation. And this has very important reasons, far beyond simply protecting the civilian population of Ukraine, which is indeed very important, but it's by no means the only reason. So, well, I am a war correspondent in Donbass, a geopolitical analyst, and I am here to explain an issue that I have been wanting to clarify for a very long time. What is happening with these massive attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure by the Russian Federation? Why have they taken so long to happen? And why are they being carried out under the conditions in which they are being carried out? Stay until the end because every little point here is super relevant. We're starting with them right now. First, we emphasize and repeat the basics again. Russia has been there indeed, defending the civilian population of Ukraine to the very end, considering these people as a brotherly nation. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, at one point, addressing the collective West that was there, as if trying to raise the stakes. In terms of whether they would launch longer-range missiles directly against Russian territory, he said, "Watch out for that. If a total war starts here, we're not going to have any damn consideration for you, who are the enemies of NATO." It's not at all comparable to the consideration we're showing the Ukrainian people, who are a brotherly people, and this war hurts us as much as anyone, even more than, in fact, the Kiev regime, which is doing the bare minimum to protect its own people, practically risking the lives of its own population day in and day out. But we also have to be very serious and very rigorous. And when answering the question of why Russia, why is it one of the most important? There have been calls for Russia to shut down Ukraine, to disconnect it from the power grid, to create a real dark winter for them, which is what we call it here, especially in Russian. That is a total blackout because this has been demanded year after year. Come on, Ukraine needs to be disconnected and it needs to be done right now. Russia has waited 4 years in the first place. And here, well, I'm going to do it now. Not even objective criticism, because I couldn't do anything else if I really wanted to succeed with the future of the special military operation. And here I'm going to explain very clearly the strategy of the Russian Federation. A war of attrition, particularly Vladimir Putin's strategy of moving very slowly, of seeing how far the red lines go, even moving them at a certain point. Well, it's definitely not a coincidence. If the Russian Federation had made the same stupid mistake that the North Atlantic Alliance did, especially the European Union, well, with the Biden administration leading the way, it must be said they really rushed and said, well, let the bells ring. Here we go. Now with the maximum sanctions against the Russian Federation, we're going to bring it down in no time. We're going to drop the nuclear bomb. We're going to disconnect it from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication System. In short, soldiers here and there, soldiers everywhere, NATO officials going up and down. The European Parliament kept piling one package of sanctions on top of another. In other words, what they did was the opposite of what they intended. The biggest thing they could do to Russia. They played all their aces and threw them right in their face, one after another. And then, at a certain point, when it turned out that Vladimir Putin didn't even seem to have that absolutely terrible terminal illness that every Western television channel kept saying was getting worse and worse, nor did he turn out to be a complete idiot. Quite a character, really. Does NATO think that everyone is like them? Like the saying, the thief thinks everyone else is a thief? But it turns out they've run straight into reality and the ace is up the sleeve. So, Ursula, what else can we get out of this? Throw something at him, even if it's just some panties. Quiet, we just have to get through this somehow. Hold on for a few more minutes. And yes, indeed, the sanctions ended up not working. In fact, they're actually working against those who imposed them in the first place, especially in the long run. Meanwhile, the Russian Federation steadily escalated the campaign, readying production and military machinery. All of this, but of course, the energy attacks, which I haven't forgotten. It's just that I needed to get to this exact point after saying everything before, are happening right now. Because if Russia had done the same thing as the European Union, it most likely would have been sunk internationally. Even such a historic ally of Russia, especially lately, which is China. And watch out, because people talk a lot about Russian traitors, but I hardly ever see anyone mention these terrible Chinese traitors. But is China really a country that can give lessons on how to act according to its own interests? I mean, here we buy oil from Russia at very low prices, but from time to time, we still sell some parts for drone assembly to Ukraine. And it wasn't until a few months into the special military operation that China actually started to put the real machinery into action. Support, yes, quietly, but support nonetheless for the Russian Federation. What do I mean by this? Well, that on an international level, with the West having, after all, the world organized and divided, right? The influence within it. In its own image, with most of the international community pretty much under control. If Russia starts bombing Ukraine to pieces like NATO did in Yugoslavia, yes, indeed, in a terrible act of utter hypocrisy. But from NATO, would they convince, or at least try to convince, the whole world that Vladimir Putin, in his terrible and tremendous military madness, the huge bastard, the dictator of the Russian Federation, is effectively attacking the civilian population of Ukraine? And he wants to leave them without electricity, without water, without light, without absolutely anything, without supplies. In fact, the Russian Federation has been doing the exact opposite. In other words, Russia has gradually made it clear to the rest of the international community that what it wants to achieve is absolutely the opposite. We will support the Ukrainian population, proceed step by step, initiate the special military operation, and prepare for it in such a way that everyone at a given moment can understand who the bad guys are and who are really on the side of the truth. Yes, this has taken 4 years, but in that time, China is already openly offering direct support. In 4 years, moreover, a highly strategic military treaty has been signed with North Korea. In 4 years, a lot of things have happened, and we see how in 4 years, NATO has been completely worn out. There's an open rift between the United States and the European partners, meaning the North Atlantic Alliance has practically gone down the drain. And now nobody cares about what the Russian Federation does in Ukraine, whether it's attacking the energy infrastructure or doing whatever the heck it wants. So, well, that's how it is now. Indeed, it took a very long time to get here, but the exact moment to attack has finally arrived. And what about the timing? Once again, Vladimir Putin has been proven right. But that's not all. There's also the need to prepare the international community and to ensure a certain image at the international level. Yes, waiting so long is frustrating, but that's often the case, especially in geopolitics. There's also an absolutely strategic issue where the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure are accompanied. Collateral damage among the civilian population. They have to go down to the subway, live without electricity, be without heating. So, you see, it's kind of a double-edged sword at first, leaving such an important city, especially like Kiev, without electricity. It interrupts the entire production process, which is obvious. It's the logical consequence. But in addition, the production process is disrupted on an even larger scale in the long run. Why do I say this? I say this because the civilian population that used to go to the factory to, for example, to produce drones, well, if they were working there, whether it was producing drones or doing any other secondary task necessary for what would be the normal maintenance of the infrastructure, for the functioning of the infrastructure throughout the city. Because obviously now everything is very interconnected at the moment when these workers don't return from the factory to a warm home where they can truly enjoy the peace of their home together with their loved ones. Of course, they can't recover either. In the long run, this ends up affecting the production process even more. That is, workers rest less and less, and workers are increasingly worried. Problems arise in the production chain, so they are increasing drastically, practically multiplying at times. And to this, we must add the necessary fact that workers are also starting to suffer from depression. They are experiencing these medical leaves, which are also linked to the overall situation throughout the city. And to this, we must add, this exhaustion in the form of these massive attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure that the Russian Federation is carrying out right now, which obviously, first of all, targets the Ukrainian military industrial complex, meaning it will hit Ukraine right in the heart and affect it primarily, above all, on the battlefield. But there's another point to consider. I find it very interesting, and it seems that there is a bet on a movement of citizens within Ukrainian territory. At the very least, it seems they are trying to isolate as much as possible the central part, as well as the eastern part of Ukraine. And not only to isolate it, but also in some way to remove all the human component from it. And Russia doesn't do it the way, for example, the North Atlantic Alliance would, like blowing up Yugoslavia. Bombings, which was one of their star operations, is not part of the Russian Federation's operations. In Ukraine, nothing even remotely similar is being done. What we see are very precise, very specific attacks, but of course, as this accumulation of damage continues, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Ukraine to repair what was previously damaged. So fewer and fewer attacks are needed. But above all, to try to do everything possible so that the population of eastern and central Ukraine goes somewhere else. In this sense, it could be closely related to the fact that within these territories, there are absolutely civilian buildings and industrial production plants. And here we could even talk about underground plants. That is to say, the Russian Federation ultimately is attacking where Ukraine is currently being hurt the most, where Ukraine will notice it the most, and where it hurts the most. Above all, I repeat, in strategic terms, and here we have a kind of analysis that I think is very important and interesting to share. One of the most interesting versions about the reasons for the successive isolation of Ukrainian cities is the story of the supposed mass coercion to relocate from central and eastern Ukraine. But why exactly? Is it worth considering this as a viable theory? Let's see. First of all, cutting off electricity is a good tool for pressure, but it is extremely difficult to control from the perspective of social processes. For the enemy, that is, what it brings is not only chaos at a specific point, but also chaos regarding the relocation itself in several places. At the same time, people don't go where they're supposed to according to the evacuation plan, but rather they go wherever they can. Some go abroad, others to small cities and towns closer to the sources of electricity generation. Others simply adapt to the new conditions. It's not possible to manage the movement of millions of people through an infrastructure collapse without administrative and enforcement control, which the Kiev regime doesn't have right now, because this would require resources they also don't have. Secondly, Western Ukraine is not physically capable of becoming a repository for the entire remaining population. That is, the problem with these humanitarian flows that Ukraine is facing will have lasting consequences. And a lot of it, not in terms of housing, nor in terms of jobs, maybe in terms of energy, but again, Western Ukraine is not unlimited. Furthermore, the attacks on energy serve much more practical purposes. This undermines the industry and the military-industrial complex in the complex too. Real estate aid, Virleles Reis, real estate aid, Ella. What we and they test. Free share this, a debt with which and a trace and I sacrifices for each night with a zodiac. Gradually move westward. It's not the goal, but a side effect. Ukraine is shrinking not demographically, but economically and infrastructurally. And the East and center are losing stability. Activity is concentrated where there is still light and where there is warmth. And the less electricity there is and the more localized it is, the more this effect will manifest. If the real goal were truly the deliberate eviction of the entire country by the Russian Federation, the attacks, of course, would look completely different. Total, continuous, final, with immediate political ultimatums. But this is not being observed on the ground right now, and most likely Russia will never end up acting this way. But the main point and the key thing is, notice how from a simple kind of massive attacks, well, they actually ended up happening much later. A lot of consequences are coming out that the Kiev regime has to deal with now. If this had been done right at the beginning of the special military operation, they would have all the resources, they would have all the energy in many ways, they would have all the support and all the help in countless ways, also from the entire North Atlantic Alliance. However, this is happening now when Ukraine no longer has any of this, and NATO can barely provide support, while the United States has nearly stepped out of the equation. So the question I throw out there for you once we've analyzed this issue is, was Vladimir Putin right or not by deciding to organize these massive attacks by the Russian Federation against Ukraine's energy infrastructure in such a particular way?